With data growth rates now measuring in the tens of zettabytes annually, it comes as no surprise that IBM's announcements around tape storage have the industry buzzing. We traveled to the IBM Executive Briefing Center in Tucson, Arizona to get information about IBM's new LTO-8 technology firsthand.
A few years ago we celebrated 60 years of tape and 59 years of tape is dead. So yeah, tape is very uniquely positioned for really kind of, I'll say, two key aspects. One is the extremely high capacity. It stays on that areal density curve and stays ahead of disk, and while there may be occasional variations of coming closer together and opening up differences, tape has maintained that for many, many years. The cost effectiveness is, goes across industries. Everybody needs to save money. Everybody needs to deal with storing in a cost effective manner. And then kind of a side highlight of cost effectiveness, there's a lot of parameters in TCO, including density. And so tape densities, exceed all other storage densities as we maintain those areal density improvements.
I started out 31 years ago with IBM as a developer for DFHSM on the mainframe, and its sole function was to move hot data once it cools off from disk to move it onto tape. And 80–90% of mainframe customers, their data is cold on tape, being kept for long-term purposes for a variety of legitimate reasons, leaving the disk and flash for the hot data that needs all of that performance at its optimum. Now, on other distributed systems such as Unix and Windows and Linux, we're finding the same dynamic applies just 20 years later. People are finding that they're keeping data longer for analytics, they're keeping data longer for government compliance, they're keeping it for active archives so that they can reference back to the information. And this stuff is cold, it's not accessed on a daily basis. So yes, you still have 80–90% of your data is cold, with the hot edge, the data that is the most recent, the most active data, still on flash and disk.
If you've been around for a long time, it was like, remember the Chrome tape, which was the good stuff that you flick the switch in your tape deck to have the good performance. All technologies have evolutions like this, Chrome to MP to barium ferrite. What comes next? Strontium ferrite. I've heard other things in the press people have talked about. I think the sputtered is just another example of the technology that's potentially yet to be put into tape. I like to point at those as we have roadmap insurance. We're not sitting there bumping our heads against some technology law of physics like the hard disk is. We have a lot of options going forward, and whether it's Fuji on Strontium or Sony on sputtered or something else that we haven't yet heard about, there's something that we can use to keep pushing the value prop of tape forward.
Eric Herzog, Chief Marketing Officer and Vice President with IBM's Storage Division, is fond of comparing the storage infrastructure model of the company to a Pittsburgh steak: hot edge, cold center. To get a bit more detail about what Herzog meant, we turned to IBM's thought leaders at the Executive Briefing Center in Tucson, Arizona.
What's interesting about Herzog's example is I always think to myself, okay, what are the sides? And the sides better complement what we intend to deliver associated with software defined. An example of that is what we do with Spectrum Archive, LTFS. That enables this idea of consumability with regards to file sets and the data that you want to ensure simplicity on. It's basically like a USB for tape.
The primary workload today for tape is archive. For backup, 70% of backups are still on tape. 30% are either on cloud or disk-based approaches, virtual tape libraries or disk repositories for storing up backups, or even USB thumb drives or USB external drives as a way to do backups. So it's still a huge role for backups to use tape, but the real advantage is long-term retention. If you look at the costs over, say, 7 to 10 years, you would have to swap out your disk 2 or 3 times during the same time you have one tape generation with one tape library and tape cartridge technology during that same period. So you would have more stability, if you will, on the tape environment than having to do it on a disk that gets changed a lot.
Whether you're talking about IBM's enterprise tape format, Jaguar, or the linear tape open, LTO format, tape is coming into greater use, even by clouds, which were once touted as a tape killer platform.
Tape is very important to cloud providers. I think they're providing some of our best, not only our best testimonials of the benefits of tape, but it's kind of exciting times for us in terms of driving new requirements, driving new needs for innovation for us as developers. That's the kind of thing we thrive on. That's coming from the cloud providers, and then what we see is a kind of a tip of the spear. Others of our customers saying, "Yeah, I want that." Even if you're putting that disk onto cloud storage with fast access characteristics, that's also being backed up somewhere in the cloud, and there are going to be some high percentage of them that are utilizing tape for that reason.
We partner with cloud service providers. They come in with their mountain bikes and camel packs in order to substantiate they provide for different thinking, usually deeper thinking with regards to what's required for LTO or potentially JAG. Our partners in the cloud services area are both enterprise as well as entry to mid-range. Based on their particular use cases associated with the environment that they intend to run some of the technology in. So cloud service providers, we feel like there's a vertical now that is clear, and we, IBM, want to be part of that infrastructure.
Some pundits and trade press writers have recently called into question the efficacy of tape when used together with so-called active archives. They wonder whether or not data can be retrieved from a tape fast enough to make it useful for applications such as big data. IBM gave us their view.
Some analytics is crunching data that is within the same 24-hour period. However, there's other data that you are looking for long-term trends, long-term analysis, and the process of analytics is terribly slow to begin with. It's mathematical models that take hours or days to do, and the time to fetch the data from tape is the least of the problems. It really isn't affecting the mathematical models. It fetches data, it processes the data, it then fetches more data and processes the data, and in the time that it's taking to process the data, it has to do all of the math. It has to do a variety of cross correlations to look for those patterns and develop these models. Again, the time to fetch the data from tape is not the major bottleneck. We have a project at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. They record all of their TV shows, award ceremonies, things of that nature, and they have most of the data on tape with maybe the first 3 minutes on flash. So when you hit the play button, you're playing the first 3 minutes from flash, and that gives us plenty of time to fetch the tape and position it, which on average is 75 seconds total from the time you actually start the robotics to the time you position. That 40 milliseconds to actually go from the front of the tape to the middle of the tape is too small to even consider in that space, but it doesn't matter. It's ready to go. People are familiar with buffering on Netflix or whatever when they're watching, and it's basically fetching from tape. YouTube, you watch another video for advertising while it's buffering from tape, and then you watch the actual video you're looking at, and nobody seems to have a problem with that. In fact, it can be monetized. Like I said, tape being 20 to 25 times cheaper than disk, really you can compensate for a lot with that difference in price.
In addition to capacity, durability, and cost efficiency, another reason for the renewed interest in tape may very well be data security.
At the end of the day, IT budgets aren't going up, but data storage request and demand is going up. So you have to figure out how to solve that problem. And you can't do it all online. And I do think your point about the recent hackathons and things like that that are exposing weaknesses on online data is going to drive some demand into tape for that air gap reason. I mean, Google's loss years ago wasn't a hack, it was a software bug as I understand it. But it illustrates the same point, is they had to have that air gap to have that disease or whatever you want to call it not propagate through everything. And Yeah, I think some of the large cloud guys are actually looking at it for that reason too, is how do I create an air gap that I don't have to worry about getting infections running across my whole environment.
The air gap is very sensitive right now because of breaches and ransomware, where they hack into a system and are able to encrypt your data and then hold you ransom with having to pay to get your data back. And having that air gap means that you have some data protection preventing that modification and encryption that could easily be unnoticed otherwise. The encryption is certainly a critical factor. We had a state government agency, I won't tell you which state in the United States, but their model of disaster recovery was to give the most recently new hired employee a box of cartridges to store in the back trunk of his car so that it would be stored in his apartment, in the garage of his apartment, and then returned the next day. And they used that methodology for a while until somebody had their car stolen. Encryption became very important in the tape world. In these breaches that we're finding, only 4% is encrypted. 96% of the world's data is unencrypted, and for a long time that was because it impacted the performance. It impacted the database performance, it impacted online transaction processing, but in a tape environment, it's real time. The encryption happens at line speed. There is no trade-off with encryption. You get the encryption immediately, and everyone encrypts their tapes. There isn't anyone who isn't encrypting their tapes. And the cost is managing keys. And so we have a security key lifecycle manager that basically keeps track of the keys and doles them out to the tapes when needed, and it's all done over a secure connection so that unless you have access to those keys, you can't make any inference of the data on the tape.
We were the first, from a technology perspective, to deliver tape encrypting drives. In addition, we work with partners based on the software side or even in mainframe to enable this idea of pervasive encryption. So tape is highly secure, and we intend to improve our overall security as we learn more, because we have to substantiate a highly secure environment for some of the most at-risk clients we have in the marketplace.
Even with the many improvements in tape technology that we've seen over the past 2 decades, there are still those who are concerned that a skills gap is going to inhibit the adoption of tape technology going forward.
It's important that we ensure that we scream from the rooftops about tape and how we enable consumability within certain workloads, like for instance virtualization. So in partnership with VMware, we're more now thinking about how to establish what we do with the 4500 or the tape library line and grow from a stackable 3U and beyond.
Be careful. People of our age group have a tape experience, and a lot of it is ejecting the VCR and pulling out the 3 threads of tape inside and trying to get the rest of it out of there, right? So there is this kind of consumer tape problem for our generation of all the hassles with tape getting pulled apart. The newbie generation actually is probably going to be much more accepting of tape once they start using it, because they don't have that kind of consumer-based experience. All they have is the IT-based experience, which of course, as you know, is night and day different than a consumer tape experience. It's kind of like comparing consumer flash to a large mainframe sort of flash. Much difference in performance, much difference in reliability. So we're looking at, one of the things we're trying to do in IBM is kind of promote tape to be more usable. Our research in Zurich is working on something we call Open LTFS, which is essentially think of it as a Spectrum archive non-clustered that we would like to make open sourced. We are putting a Swift stack on top of that, HLM Swift stack, which is basically a latency tier so that you can have optical made or tape in an object store. Part of the idea is now that becomes something that can be consumable in universities and other places very simply. You don't have to have a tape head and somebody go get a special software, backup application to use tape. Now you can download the open source Swift stack, You can use the open source open LTFS, and you can have a small tape presence in a small lab without a huge cost and complexity. So that's part of this idea of we need to make tape relevant again from the ground up almost.
We have wrapped tape with tape libraries and automation to the point where it's yet another black box that you point data at. And with most of that automation, rarely do you have to physically touch a tape cartridge, physically mount a tape cartridge, or physically put a tape cartridge in a box and ship it off somewhere, depending on your business. A lot of media and entertainment that used to be familiar with Betamax and VHS videotape have easily switched over to LTO tape as an alternative that stores hundreds of hours of high-definition video on a single cartridge. That is no change for them. And companies that use tapes to pass information from supplier to supplier, credit card information, things like that, again, not anything new to them. This is something they've been doing for a while. I don't see really any unique skills that couldn't be learned in a few days or a few weeks regarding tape. There's the proper handling of tape. Don't pour coffee on it. Don't run over the cartridge with a truck. But other than that, I don't really see a skills shortage that needs to be addressed over a longer period of time.
It may seem like IBM is ahead of the curve with its announcement of LTO-8 drives and libraries, especially given the fact that only yesterday we were being told about their Generation 7 tape technology. Is there a reason why LTO-8 announcements are coming so far ahead of the cartridge itself?
We're announcing I guess you could say the availability of LTO-8 technology, which is the announcement of the LTO-8 drive and when we expect it to be ready for market. We're not announcing everything like when the media is available because the TPCs haven't worked through all the licensing and agreements and all that. So technically we can't really go forward with everything, but we are ready with the technology and the drive, so we're going to be talking about that.
We decided it was important for us to run to the races, deliver an LTO-8 drive. Even though we've just recently, of course, delivered LTO-7, to substantiate our commitment as ecosystem partners to the marketplace as it relates to tape.
Actually, LTO-8 is back to our historical pace in LTO. We used to be around 2 years, maybe 2 1/4, something like that. Then in the time frame of the big financial crash in LTO-6, we kind of spaced it out with more like 3 years or so. Now we're back to the 2-year pace. I mean, we're back to a technology that scales. We have the capability. So we generally believe the market needs more tape and needs more capacity. And if we can do it, we'll do it.
With today's announcement of a new LTO-8 tape drive, IBM is demonstrating its continued support for the LTO tape roadmap. To learn more about IBM's products and solutions with respect to tape technology, contact your IBM representative or IBM business partner today.